On January 16, 2026, Mark Carney stood in a frozen park in the heart of Beijing, the Temple of the Sun, and told the entire world something Washington was not ready to hear. He said China had become a more predictable partner than the United States. He did not whisper it, he said it into a microphone in front of cameras, with the Great Hall of the People at his back and a deal already signed. 3,000 miles away, in a social media post on Truth Social, Donald Trump responded 8 days later with a threat that would have historically brought a U.S. ally to its knees: 100% tariff on everything, all Canadian goods, all of them, immediately. Canada did not fold. Let me explain exactly what happened here, because the mainstream coverage is getting the story wrong. This is not a trade dispute. This is not a disagreement over electric vehicles and canola. What you are watching right now is the most consequential realignment of North American geopolitics since the end of the Cold War, and Washington does not yet understand what it has triggered. Here is the sequence of events you need to know. In October 2025, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, a man who has managed sovereign financial crises for a living, met Xi Jinping on the sidelines of APEC in South Korea. And he called it a turning point. That was the signal. That was the opening move. Then, on January 15th and 16th of 2026, Carney flew to Beijing for 4 days of structured meetings with Xi, Premier Li Qiang, and senior members of the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress. He was the first Canadian Prime Minister to set foot in China. In 8 years, he did not go as a supplicant, he went as a strategist. The deal he came back with is worth understanding in its precise mechanics. Canada agreed to admit up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles at a tariff of just 6.1%, down from the 100% tariff that had been in place since 2024, a tariff Canada had adopted in lockstep with the Biden administration to shield domestic auto industries from Chinese overcapacity. In exchange, China agreed to slash its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from a combined rate of approximately 85% down to 15% by March 1st of 2026. China also agreed to remove anti-discrimination tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas through the end of the year. Carney's government projected that those measures would unlock nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian farmers, fishers, and processors. Let that sink in for a moment. Canada's canola seed market in China was worth $4 billion before those tariffs effectively shut it down. More than 2 million tons of canola went unsold in the second half of 2025 compared to the prior year. Saskatchewan farmers had been absorbing that devastation quietly while Ottawa tried to manage the American relationship. Carney went to Beijing and in 48 hours secured what years of diplomatic patience with Washington never delivered: relief, concrete, measurable, real. And on January 16th, when a reporter asked Trump whether he was concerned about the growing closeness between Carney and Xi, the President of the United States said, and I want you to hear this carefully, that's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. That was a Friday. 8 days later, on a Saturday morning, the same man posted on Truth Social that Canada would be hit with a 100% tariff on all goods, all products, if it made a deal with China. He called Carney governor. He suggested Canada was positioning itself as a drop-off port for Chinese goods flooding into the American market. He declared that China would eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. This is not a trade policy. This is a man operating on 1980s real estate logic in a 2026 networked world. To the volume of goods covered by the deal he claims to be angry about, 49,000 electric vehicles, represents approximately 2.5% of annual Canadian auto sales. It is, as one trade lawyer at Macmillan put it on live television, statistically a rounding error. Trump changed his position in 8 days, without new information, without new conditions, because a speech in Davos offended him. Here is what the administration did not anticipate: the Davos speech. On January 20th, before Trump had even taken the stage at the World Economic Forum, Mark Carney stood at that podium in Switzerland and said something that ricocheted across every foreign ministry and central bank in the Western world. He told the assembled global leadership, without once uttering Trump's name, that the rules-based international order was fading. He said that middle powers had to act together because, and these are his exact words, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. He spoke of a rupture between the United States under Trump and its Western allies that he said would never fully heal. He also said, standing at the World Economic Forum with Trump scheduled to speak days later, that Canada's relationship with China had become, in recent months, more predictable, and that results were following from that predictability. Trump revoked Carney's invitation to join his Board of Peace within 24 hours. Now, let us talk about what a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods would actually mean. Not in the abstract. In the concrete, Canada exports approximately 20% of its entire GDP to the United States. 20%. That number should terrify you more than any headline. Canadian officials have already stated that a full 100% tariff scenario would have, in their words, severe and immediate consequences for both economies. Notice that phrase, both economies. Because here is the connection nobody on cable news is discussing clearly enough. The North American supply chain is not a pipeline running south. It is a circulatory system. Canadian steel and aluminum are embedded in American manufacturing. Canadian energy runs into American homes. The auto sector alone represents a web of cross-border assemblies so integrated that a single vehicle manufactured in Michigan may cross the Canadian border 8 times before it is complete. General Motors projected $3 to $4 billion in tariff exposure in its 2026 financial guidance, and that was before the threat of 100% escalation. What happens to American consumers when that exposure compounds? The math is merciless. Trump already raised tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% in August 2025, up from 25%. Canadian households are already absorbing an estimated $1,700 to $2,000 in higher annual costs. Canadian GDP has already contracted by 1.5 to 2% as a direct result of the 2025 and 2026 tariff cycle, and that is at 35%, not 100%. Here is what Carney did next. He did not hold an emergency press conference. He did not threaten counter-tariffs in a Truth Social post. His government stated, cleanly and without dramatics, that Canada was not pursuing a free trade agreement with China, and that all its obligations under CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Trade Agreement, would be respected, and that the deal in question was entirely consistent with those obligations. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc issued a single statement confirming they were not negotiating a free trade pact with Beijing. Carney himself told reporters on Sunday that what Canada had done with China was simply to rectify some issues that have developed in the last couple of years. That is how a central banker responds to a brawler, with precision, with documentation, with a scalpel where the other side brought a sledgehammer. Capital has no patriotism. That is a hard truth, and it is the truth Washington refuses to absorb. When Carney told reporters in Beijing that Canada intended to increase its exports to China by 50% by 2030, he was not making a rhetorical gesture. He was announcing a structural portfolio rebalancing when he told the same reporters that Canada would scale up to producing 50 million tons of LNG per year for Asian markets by 2030. He was not posturing. He was identifying a demand curve and positioning his country to fill it. Even the former governor of the Bank of England does not hold press conferences to bluff. Here is the historical pattern worth naming explicitly. When British manufacturing began relocating to the American colonies in the late 18th century, Parliament tried tariffs, restrictions, and export bans on skilled workers. It did not work when Japan pivoted its export markets towards Southeast Asia in the 1980s after American protectionist pressure. Economists in Washington predicted the strategy would fail within a decade. Those economists were wrong. The pattern is not new. The pattern is ancient. Economic coercion applied against a sovereign nation with options does not produce submission. It produces diversification. It produces exactly what you are now watching unfold in real time between Ottawa and Beijing. Multiple world leaders, including South Korea's president and the UK Prime Minister, have either already visited Xi or are scheduling visits. The Canada-China reset is not an isolated bilateral event. It is the opening chapter of a broader realignment that Beijing has been carefully engineering since Trump's first term. China is positioning itself as the stable, predictable, rule-following partner, and the United States, under this administration, Tosh is handing it the credibility to make that case. Watch for 3 things. First, watch whether Trump actually moves to implement a 100% tariff, or whether this joins the growing list of threats, including the 10% tariff escalation he announced and never imposed over an Ontario anti-tariff advertisement. That functioned as noise rather than policy. His own track record on Canada suggests more bluster than follow-through, but the threat itself is damaging. Every Canadian boardroom is already running contingency models. Second, watch the CUSMA review. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement is due for renegotiation in 2026. That review is now happening in the shadow of a 100% tariff threat and a Canadian Prime Minister who just flew to Beijing and called China more predictable than Washington. That is the negotiating table on which everything will actually be resolved or destroyed. Third, watch Carney's domestic coalition. Ontario Premier Doug Ford called the EV deal lopsided and warned that China now has a foothold in the Canadian market. Ford has been largely aligned with Carney's agenda until this deal. If that fracture deepens, it complicates Carney's ability to execute the diversification strategy at the pace his Beijing commitments require. Here is what this moment actually is. It is a test, not just of Canada's economic resilience, or of Trump's willingness to inflict mutual damage on a neighbor whose economy is woven into his own. It is a test of whether the rules-based international order that American leadership spent 80 years constructing can survive American leadership abandoning it. Carney said in Davos that the rupture with allies under Trump would never fully heal. He may be right, not because the damage is irreparable in any technical diplomatic sense, but because every day that passes is another day Canada. The European Union, South Korea, Japan, and the UK run the numbers and find the same answer. The diversification math works. The dependency math does not. Canada does not live because of the United States. Canada thrives because it is Canadian. Those words, spoken by a prime minister standing on the plains of Abraham, ground soaked in the history of a nation that has always had to define itself against a more powerful neighbor, were not a talking point. They were a declaration of strategic intent. The empire does not always recognize the moment it overplays its hand. Sometimes that moment is only visible in hindsight, when the moving trucks are already loaded and crossing the border and the forwarding address is somewhere in Beijing. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The geography of global trade is being redrawn in real time, and nobody in Washington has a map.